Welcome back, Honors. All right, welcome back to your second of your 2 Thanksgiving break flips, right? And we're not going to keep this one super long. We're actually going to keep it pretty short and condensed with not a lot of editing and stuff like that, just so we can go ahead and get this thing done, because we're talking about the Renaissance, and y'all need to focus on doing your Renaissance artwork research, which is the main priority bulk of the stuff that you need to do for this Thanksgiving break, right? So let's go ahead and jump off right where we left off, right? We were talking about the Renaissance starting in Italy, right? We were discussing about why it started there. We're talking about the big city-states it started in, Venice, Milan, Florence. Remember, you need a picture of this bad boy in your notes. You actually should have actually drawn this or screenshotted or something along those lines. And we talked about 4 different key places: Venice, Milan, Florence, and the Papal States, right? We also spent that entire time talking about like a lot of different other concepts, right? Talking about what the Renaissance means, how it's actually coming from ancient Rome and Greek like ideals, right, and stuff like that. But the big guiding force behind the Renaissance is actually this key concept known as humanism, right? Because these thinkers that existed during this time period, during the late 1300s and the early 1400s, started to kind of like re-examine these old like Roman and Greek ideas, and they started to use them to discover new ones, right? So they actually start so to start to discover like a lot of new ideas, this idea or this concept of examining the world around you, understand why is he so cute, right? Like asking like some like questions like that, trying to be able to read certain texts, trying to understand where all these different things come from. How did the Romans build so many big things, right? Like how do you figure all that out? That is all considered a branch of humanism, right? Humanism is the study of worldly subjects, right? It is a key concept of the Renaissance, and it's a wildly important word. So it's very, very important that you highlight it, underline it, make it look like it's exploding. It's very, very, very key, okay? So this whole idea is also focused on the individual, right? So the humanistic growth idea is like very, very important when we're trying to figure out how can I be the best possible version of myself, right? How can I be the smartest possible version? If I am an artist, how can I be the best artist? If I'm a scientist, how can I be the best scientist, right? Humanism is the guiding force that actually kind of really, really uses the examples of like explosions of the arts, or like the example of humanism, right? So like when art began to explode all over the Renaissance, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the birth of Venus, Primavera, the Last Supper, the Mona Lisa, all those things, those are examples of humanistic behavior of artists, right? So the thing about humanism also though is it's not confined into art individually, right? You also have people like Da Vinci demonstrating this idea of like the true Renaissance man, right? Somebody who is actually well-versed in multiple different subjects, right? So actually we have right here 2 very, very important pieces of information from Leonardo da Vinci's journals, right? So the thing about it is you can see humanistic behavior inside of his journals, right? So these journals were actually written by Leonardo da Vinci in code and in backwards like font, so he would be the only one that knew how to read them when he took a mirror and stuck it in the binding, right? He also used these journals to study different things, right? He was curious. He asked a lot of questions. For example, he wanted to know what did the child look like inside of a mother's womb during gestation, or actually during development. So what he did is he actually dug up and like acquired a dead mother and child who had actually died before the child was ever given birth to, and he dissected that body, and he actually used his chalk inside of his journals to actually draw these different images, right? Showing the actual like what's it called? The actual like the uterus, right? The birthing walls and things like that, and also the placenta and how it's attached to the inside of the mother, and also showing the image of a child and how it was actually clutched up inside of the womb, right? So this is an example of humanism because he wanted to know what it looked like, right? And this other key example as well is known as the Vitruvian man. Go ahead and jot that word down. Vitruvian man. V-I-T-R-U-V-I-A-N. The Vitruvian man, right? He also used this in his journals as well to try and understand the proportion of the human form, right? He actually uses this Vitruvian man, this chart, to understand that, oh, my height is the same as my like fingertip to fingertip wingspan, right? So if you were right now to be watching this flip and you spread your arms out all the way, from fingertip to fingertip is pretty much about how tall you are, right? The Vitruvian man demonstrated this. Also, do you see right here this section of the human forearm, right? From elbow to wrist, that's the same size as your foot, right? So like that's why he has this one foot angled out compared to this one right there. So if you actually take your foot right now and you actually like took it and put it next to your forearm, it's actually the same size as your forearm from wrist to elbow, right? So the Vitruvian man is another very famous example of these humanist constructs, right? Now that is a great thing. We know that it happened in Italy. We know that humanism is driving it forward. We know that Renaissance means rebirth. We know it's the reemergence of Roman and Greek ideas. All of that's fine and good. but why Italy, right? Don't we need a good list of why Italy? Don't we need like a good understanding of why Italy? Why did all this take place in Italy? What was so special about Italy, right? Well, Italy, first and foremost, was the home to the former Roman Empire, right? So when we're talking about the rebirth of sorts, we know that rebirth of Greek and Roman ideals are happening. So basically, wherever the Roman Empire was, it's probably going to be the home to where the Renaissance and the rebirth of European intelligence happens as well following the Middle Ages, right? So the big thing about that, though, is because it was the former home of the Roman Empire, you've also got many different ruins, thank you, buddy, many different ruins that are actually there for study, artifacts that are still in good conditions for study and interpretation. You could walk up to the Colosseum and try to understand Roman architecture. Granted, it looked a little bit crusty due to the fact that they got hit by an earthquake in 1329, so, but still, and also because people were like stealing stone and bronze out of it to build churches and stuff. But still, there were some ruins and artifacts available there still for good condition for study and interpretation, right? Another big reason why Italy is because it's the center for trade. You've got Venice bringing in goods from the Byzantine and the Ottoman Empire. You've got Milan actually trading those goods throughout all of Europe. You've got Florence taking all that money and putting it into banks and also learning how to condense textiles and things like that. And you got the Papal States that's actually taking a tax, a 10% tax, the tithe off of all these people. So if their money's going up, their tithe is going up, the Catholic Church is making more money. So the fact that Italy was the center for all that trade and economics is a big reason why. Now, do we have other reasons? Of course we do, right? Speaking of the Papal States, right? They're bringing in buttloads of money via the tithe and things like that. So they are going to become major buyers of artwork. And we'll get into all that stuff here in a little bit, right? When we talk about this sixth and final reason on this list, right? Another big reason why is because this is the European continent center for banking, right? So the thing about it is Florence, they became so popular with their banking system that actually the florent, known as like, it's their currency, it's called the florent or the Florentine florent, right? This gold coin became the standard measurement of currency throughout all of Europe. If you had a florent, you could buy anything. So that's really important that you understand that their banking was so prevalent that Italy became the European center for banking. And where there is a lot of money, there is a lot of people who have that money. Where there are people who have that money, there are people who want to spend that money, right? And the big thing about the Renaissance is that is going to be its big driving force, is all of this money, this liquid asset sitting around leads to the growth of these people known as patrons, right? So patrons are the people who drove the Renaissance forward. They are the people who purchased the art. They are the people who paid the artists to produce their things. Now, some of you are like, well, wait a minute. Those drawings were in, like, Da Vinci's journals. Nobody paid him for that. Well, that's an idea of humanism. But someone obviously paid for the Mona Lisa. Someone obviously paid for the Primavera. Someone obviously paid for the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which is actually a big thing about the Catholic Church. Now, so going forward, a patron is a financial supporter. So let's say, hypothetically, this little guy right here, Pierre, right? Pierre, the Marquis de Tauris, is a very famous artist, right? He's an artist. He's got really, really good paw painting that he can do, right? So, like, and I'm like, hey, Pierre, I'm a wealthy Florentine banker, or I'm a wealthy Holy Roman Emperor, or Holy Roman Empire prince, right? Something like that. I would pay Pierre to make a portrait of my wife and I, right? That portrait becomes famous, is used as an example of Renaissance art, but I am the patron. I'm the one that paid this little nugget to actually paint the thing for me. And so the fact of the matter is there was a lot of patrons in Italy. One of them is the Catholic Church. So underneath this growth of patrons, jot down the Catholic Church. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is a fresco inside of a church. So the Catholic Church was its patron, right? The Last Supper is a mural inside of a monastery in Milan. So the Catholic Church was its patron, right? So the other big one that I would probably say, if I was going to use a good example of a Catholic Church patron, would be, The Last Judgment by Michelangelo. It's also inside the Sistine Chapel, which means that who was the patron, Pierre? The Catholic Church. Good job, buddy. Okay. Now, so the big thing, though, is that going forward, the Catholic Church wasn't the only patron. This right here is probably the most famous, Renaissance patron family that is actually from Florence. These people right here are the Medici family, right? Say that with me again. Medici family. Not the Medici, not the Medici, the Medici, all right? So the Medici family of Florence are the informal and formal rulers of Florence for over 300 years, right? Now, I could get into a bunch of really, really big, grandiose concepts and talk to you about how they're the signores of Florence, which means that they're these people that kind of basically bribe these electorates and stuff like that to constantly be the leaders and blah, 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 blah. But I'm not going to do all that to you right now. So all you need to know is that the reason why they were so powerful and why their family ruled over Florence for over 300 years, and not only ruled over Florence, but also had, count them, 1, 2, popes in their family, which is bananas, is because they created the most powerful European bank. That bank in Florence is the Medici Family Bank, right? And because they had so much money, they became huge patrons of major artworks, right? The first two to set that tone were this guy right here, known as Cosimo the Elder, and Lorenzo il Magnifico Medici, right? Lorenzo il Magnifico Medici paid for the Primavera, the birth, no, Cosimo the Elder paid for the Primavera, the birth of Venus. Now, Lorenzo, though, pays for the David. He pays for a lot of different other artworks that are coming out during this time period. He patroned Michelangelo. He actually let Michelangelo live in the Medici family house for a little while, right? So the Medici family is massively important. So do me a favor, underline them, star them, highlight them. You need to know them, okay? The Medici family. So going forward, though, the Medici family is going to be a big patron. The Catholic Church is going to be a big patron. All this money is being spent on these new arts. Well, what made this art so much better than the art that came before it? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, right? So the thing about Renaissance art that makes it so much better, and a big reason why we use it as an example of the growth of humanism and economics during this time period, is because new artistic styles are going to come to the forefront, right? We saw much more stylized art, much more beautiful art, composed with certain images and symbols and different things inside of it, right? We are now going to also start to see art that represents humans and landscapes properly, providing depth and a three-dimensional value, right? Also, speaking much more stylized, you had like more individual-looking faces. You put the imperfections of someone's face in their painting, so it actually gave them a little bit of character, right? Perspective, including real-life art, depth, proportionality, using our Vitruvian Man and things like that. Shading, to make art look more textured and much more real. And sculptors are even going to study human anatomy so they can better create human forms out of marble. Now, speaking of sculpture, as we all should already know, that was always the big art medium of the ancient Romans, right? So this right here is Augustus at Ponte Verde, right? So like, or Port-au-Prince, or one of the two. So this is a statue of Augustus that was made during the Empire period, literally just a few years after the birth of Christ, right? So this statue, in and of itself, well, actually it was made a couple years before the birth of Christ. So this statue, in and of itself, is an example of Roman art, right? Look at this Roman sculpture. Look how the arms and the legs are proportional, and Augustus looks like Augustus would have looked like in real life. Look at the detail on the breastplate, and look at the draped cloth and the massive amount of detail in this stone piece of marble. That's from the Roman Empire. This is from the Middle Ages, right? Everybody's got the same face. No one's in proportion. There's not really a background. There's no depth. It's really garbage. And then it started to get a little bit better, and they started including some other things. But look at the face. That's Mary and baby Jesus, right? So, like, baby Jesus looks like a shrunken 30-year-old man, and I don't know what's going on with Mary's face, right? So, like, but it's not quality art like you would consider in the Renaissance. For example, this right here is a Renaissance piece of Hercules slaying the centaur Nessus, right? This is another famous Renaissance piece, The Birth of Venus, that actually demonstrates the early Renaissance and the growth of proportional humans, stylized work, shading. Look at the shading and actual play of light inside of this entire piece, right? I actually took this picture, just saying. So, and then this is another famous one that I took as well. This is another Botticelli work. This is actually called Madonna with Pomegranate, right? So now the interesting part about this one is it's a good way to explain how Renaissance is going to bring on symbolism and style and things like that, and the art of the Renaissance we use to understand. Oh, thank you. Oh, God, you looked right in my mouth. All right, so anyway, now, so the big thing about this artwork is that Madonna and Pomegranate actually demonstrates several different symbols of artwork in the Renaissance, right? For example, we know that Gabriel is sitting right here to the right hand of Mary, Gabriel being the one that carried the message to Mary that she was going to give birth to the Son of God. We know it's Gabriel because he's holding a lily, right? And we also know the choirs of angels are behind her, and then we also know that looking at Mary, we have like a very subtle halo that goes around like Mary's face, showing her divinity and also showing her holy nature, right? We see that she is covered, right? Actually showing her chastity and her purity, and then we also have baby Christ right here, who actually has his own faint halo in and of himself as well. Not a big, obnoxious, glowing light halo, but just a faint halo implying his divinity, right? But then the big section of the piece that shows the different images and the different symbolism is this thing right here. In place of the flaming heart of Christ that is predominantly pictured in a lot of different Middle Age artworks, Botticelli instead placed a pomegranate, right? Why would you put a pomegranate there? Well, mainly due to the fact that the pomegranate is laid directly over where the heart would have been inside of this child, right? So behind this pomegranate would have been the heart of Christ. And so instead of the flaming heart, he used a pomegranate because pomegranates are full of these little red seeds, and these little red seeds are supposed to symbolize the individual drops of blood that this child will one day spill when he sacrifices himself for humankind. all that symbolism is just in this tiny one. So imagine the amount of symbolism in this, right? So like there's tons of symbolism in Renaissance artwork. And also, it's not just art. You also saw an explosion of architecture going forward as well. Architecture, also known as the social art, right? It's known as the social art because we can all share it together because a building is a public space, right? Architecture is going to leap forward during the Renaissance. It's known as the social art because it's just like a present piece inside of a city that everyone can walk up to and imbibe with. So going with that, it's also the Renaissance architecture is going to do away with a lot of the really craggy, really like sharp features of Gothic architecture. So that right there is Gothic architecture. That is the back end of Notre Dame, right? So we can see a lot of different ideals of Gothic architecture in this one image. This is Middle Age architecture, right? Started being built in the 1200s, so you see everything comes to a point. You see like all the different rose windows, the stained glass, the flying buttresses, the universal stone construction, the vaulted ceilings on the inside, and then I think right up there you've got gargoyles that are hanging off the side of it. So look at that Gothic architecture, and then look at this. This is Renaissance style architecture. So as you can see, look at the clean lines and domes and lantern, and also there's not as many buttresses or really sharp items, and things have rounded edges rather than really sharp ones due to the fact that Greek and Roman architecture that came before Gothic architecture was seen as much more clean and much more stylized and things like that, less disorderly. So looking at that, also domes in architecture are going to have massive frescoes on the inside of them, and they're going to actually like allude to a lot of other very famous things going forward. So for example, this dome on the inside of it was painted originally by this guy named Giorgio Vasari. This right here is the painting on the inside of this dome, right? So somebody has that dome, and I don't remember who, I think it's Gianna has the dome, right? So the thing about it, though, is this is the painting on the inside of that dome, and it has a very famous scene from a book that was written in the, like, Renaissance period. This is an image from the Divine Comedy. So big thing about it, though, is like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, wait, hold up.
Good, bag up, Terry. Put it in reverse, Terry. Put it in reverse. Oh!
That's right. It's important for you to understand. I'm probably going to use that thing 1,000 times in this, but it's very important for you to understand that writing is actually kind of where the whole Renaissance period got started off. It wasn't actually even in visual arts at first, right? So the visual arts come a little bit later. The architecture, the sculpting, all that stuff comes a little bit after writings were the thing that demonstrated the growth of the Renaissance. You're going to see people sit down and write philosophy and scholarly articles, and they're going to write guidebooks for men and women to achieve success. So the written word is actually kind of where the Renaissance got its start more than anything else. And the very first person to actually start writing to demonstrate that humanist value, to start going forward, is this guy right here, St. Thomas Aquinas, which I'm sure you've learned about in Miss Denny and Mr. Mathern's class. So the thing about St. Thomas Aquinas is he's actually alive during the late Middle Ages, but he serves as kind of a very special example of where the Renaissance began. And he actually began it with a lot of his writings. So the thing about it is during the late Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas, also known as the Big Dumb Ox because of the way he looked, because he was a very large figure that was also very quiet, he actually started translating a lot of Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher's works, into actual vernacular languages that people could understand, right? We'll talk about the word vernacular here in a minute, but we're going to bring it up a little bit later. So he's going to rebirth the idea of Aristotle's work, bring back the ideas of empirical learning and observation. And he writes a very famous text known as his essay or his observation on the soul, right? He actually starts talking about, like, is a soul exist? Where is it? Is it inside of us? Does it exist on this plane? Is it corporeal? As in, does it exist in a place where you can reach out and touch it? And St. Thomas Aquinas starts to observe a lot of things about his faith and a lot of different ideas, and he applies Renaissance ideas to religion. So in an essence, this guy kind of got the Renaissance started like way earlier than most people, and he did it by writing, not by painting, not by making a building, but by writing something. And he is going to lead to the birth of this concept known as scholasticism. So do me a favor, underline that, because that is why every time we take our exams, we usually say a prayer to St. Thomas Aquinas, because he is the patron saint of scholasticism and learners, and because he is going to be the guy that brings back the birth, or he actually kind of is the guy that births the idea of humanism. So funny enough, the Catholic Church is where the Renaissance truly kind of begins. And so then going forward, a new series of writers is going to come out after him. Well, this guy is a very famous one. His name is Dante Alighieri. His Alighieri, I think, is spelled A-G-L-H-E-I-R-I, but I could be wrong. Now, the thing about it, though, is he is a writer as well. He shows up in the early 1300s. Now, he writes a very different kind of text. He starts bringing back epic poetry. Epic poetry in the sense of literature, characters, involvement, scenes, moving through chapters, and all these different things. He basically brings back fiction. So he is an epic poet who brings back the idea of writing a really long poem. But here's the key thing. It's the language that he wrote it in. So underneath, at the end of the Middle Ages, underneath that, write down this word, vernacular. V-E-R-N-A-C-U-L-A-R. When he wrote his most famous work known as the Divine Comedy, he wrote the entire thing in a vernacular style language. And what vernacular means is a language that is commonly spoken. Like I am reading this book right now, it is written in English, which is a vernacular language. I am studying German, that is a vernacular language, because it's stuff that people speak. The thing about Dante is he breaks away from a lot of stuff because he refuses to write in Latin. Latin is not a vernacular language because no one speaks it anymore. It is a dead language that the Romans spoke. Same thing with Aramaic. Same thing with many other, like Sanskrit is another non-vernacular language. Dante instead writes in Italian, his native language, so other people can read his most famous work known as the Divine Comedy. And the Divine Comedy is a very famous work. It is a very famous long poem. So the Divine Comedy is actually his very famous work where he split it into 3 separate sections. And it's where we're going to pick up on when we come back in class on that first day. The Divine Comedy is a very famous fictional text where he talks about his journey wandering through 3 very particular places. Here are the names of those places. Inferno, aka Hell, Purgatorio, aka Purgatory, and Paradise, aka Heaven. So he tells a story where he believes that he literally is wandering through Hell, the mountain of Purgatory, and Heaven. And this becomes the first major work of vernacular literature since the fall of Rome. Okay, so we'll talk more specifically about that particular piece, though, when we get back to class. I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your break. I'll see y'all then.